In the early days of aviation, the greatest accomplishment a pilot could make was to circumnavigate the globe. A successful attempt could make a pilot's career and give them celebrity status. And many would be successful and earn this respect, but many would not and instead end up dead or in horrifying situations. This is the flight of the Atlantis, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. The very first successful circumnavigation of the globe in an airplane took place in 1924 by 4 airmen from the US Army Air Service. In total, this groundbreaking journey would see them fly for 175 days and 26,300 miles, or 42,400 kilometers. During the end of the 1920s and throughout the 1930s, the world saw many more attempts by pilots looking to make a name for themselves, and the public was just as eager to spectate on these attempts, turning everyday pilots into quasi-celebrities. While today no one would bat an eye at flying around the world, this was a dangerous and daring pursuit in the infancy of aviation that captured the public's imagination. Flying was still new and exciting, and circling the globe was seen as the greatest feat a pilot could accomplish. But for as many successful circumnavigations during the time period as there were plenty more that didn't go as planned. The most infamous among them came in 1937 when aviation pioneer Amelia Earhart set out to become the first female pilot to fly around the globe. Her plane eventually went down near Howland Island in the North Pacific Ocean, and her fate has remained a mystery ever since. 5 years before her disappearance, a team of German aviators planned to add their names to the list of explorers to circumnavigate the globe. On February 29, 1932, a Junkers W-33 seaplane called Atlantis took off from Cologne, Germany to begin its attempt. Behind the controls were pilot Hans Bertram and co-pilot Air Tom. Along for the journey as well was mechanic Adolf Klausmann and a photographer who was covering the attempt. Hans was about what you'd expect a famed pilot of the time to be like. He was handsome, charismatic, well-educated, and highly capable as an airman. It was these qualities that made everyone aboard the plane and back home in Germany confident that this would be a successful endeavor. The flight wasn't just about circumnavigating the globe though, and part of the team's duty was to explore potential world markets for Germany's aviation industry. On top of that, they'd visit German communities along the way and spread goodwill from back home. As with all flights around the world at the time, the expedition was expected to take quite a while to complete. By the time it reached its 10th week, Hans and the crew had already successfully flown through Italy, Greece, Turkey, India, and Thailand, among other countries. Once they reached Jakarta, Indonesia, the 4 men decided to split up as Hans wanted to make a side trip. It wasn't necessarily on the way, but Hans figured that while they were in the region, he could make a quick flight to explore parts of Australia. He expected it to be a relatively quick trip, and he elected Klausmann to accompany him, while the other 2 flew to Shanghai, China, where the 4 planned to rendezvous. After a brief stop to fuel up on May 13th in what is now Timor Barat, which sits between Indonesia and Australia, Hans and Klausmann took off for the city of Darwin along the extreme northern coast of Australia around midnight. The trip to Darwin was around 520 miles, or 830 kilometers, so somewhere between 5 and 6 hours of total flight time. As the plane flew on its southeast heading, they entered a storm, and it was around this time that Hans realized that they were somehow low on fuel already, likely from fighting the unusually strong headwinds. Because of this, they'd have to make an early and almost emergency landing. Just a little while later, the plane's floats touched down in the ocean, and Hans and Klausmann were hundreds of miles short of their destination. As best as Hans could figure, he thought they were on the east coast of Melville Island, which is just north of Darwin in mainland Australia. However, where they actually ended up was Cape St. Lambert along Australia's Kimberley coast, well to the southwest of both Darwin and Melville Island. Because Hans was so far off in his estimation, they had no idea the trouble they were in. Among Western Australia's 9 regions, Kimberley is the furthest north. Regardless of where you are along the coast, you've got vast ocean on one side and the barren Australian bush on the other. Kimberley has quite a history that goes back about 65,000 years as well. It's the location of one of Australia's earliest societies, where rock drawings have been discovered that have maybe the very first appearance of the boomerang. Incredibly, geographically, Kimberley is about 3 times larger than England in terms of landmass and includes steep mountain ranges and dry grasslands. Where Hans and Klausmann ended up, however, was on the side of Kimberley, which has an expansive landscape of arid, cracked clay. Kimberley also has a prolific wet season because it sits in a tropical monsoon climate, but that period had already passed for 1932. The 2 had instead arrived near the beginning of the dry season, which coincides with Australian winter, meaning temperatures would not be at their peak. With that said, it is still one of the hottest regions and can regularly see temperatures over 86 Fahrenheit or 30 Celsius even then. In any case, after guiding the plane safely ashore, Hans made a note of his fuel readings. According to the gauge, the Atlantis had just 4 gallons of fuel remaining, which wasn't really enough to fly anywhere. Once they were on shore, the men made camp for the night and checked out their surroundings for potential supplies, but all they found was a lot of nothing. And while they weren't in the thick of the Australian bush, they were certainly surrounded by it. Sometime later, while they were trying to get some rest, an Aboriginal man stumbled onto them, possibly coming to check out the area after seeing them land nearby. Aboriginal Australians are descendants of the migrants that arrived more than 60,000 years ago and are indigenous to the continent. Depending on location, Aboriginal cultures and languages vary greatly, and when they were approached by the man, the language barrier was immediately clear. The man was friendly, but neither of the aviators could understand him, so the man eventually wandered away and disappeared. Had they known just how desperate their situation was, they may have tried a little harder to communicate with the man. By the next morning, the weather had cleared and the sun was already starting to turn the heat up for the day. Hans had to figure out what to do next, and the only thing he could come up with was try to get as close to Darwin as he could before his fuel ran out. He wasn't even sure the plane had enough fuel to get airborne, but incredibly, after picking up speed and pulling back on the yoke, the Atlantis returned to the sky. Because of where Hans thought they were, he headed west and began flying more and more inland. After they had gone just 22 miles though, as expected, the engine suddenly cut out. At that point, Hans was essentially piloting a glider, which actually gave him time to try to figure out where to put the plane down. Fortunately, he was able to guide the Atlantis back to the coastline, and once again, Hans and Klausman found themselves stranded on the beach with nothing and no one around. They spent much of that day trying to locate water, but they were unsuccessful in that venture, and the longer they went without it, the more Hans thought about the Aboriginal man they encountered the night before. Despite their difficulties understanding one another verbally, it still would have been easy to indicate with hand signals that they needed water. Hans regretted leaving the area they camped in overnight, and he convinced Klausman that they needed to walk their way back in hopes of coming across these same men or others from his tribe. As they began to traverse Kimberley's unforgiving landscape, the heat and their hunger and thirst took a massive toll on the men. If that wasn't enough, they were surrounded by swarms of flies the entire time, buzzing by their ears and landing on their sweating faces. During this walk though, luckily they were able to find some water and some berries that were safe to eat. They also had a single packet of cookies one of them brought for the trip to Australia, and they began rationing those, but this did little to satisfy what had become an intense hunger, and things were about to get much worse. As they continued along the coastline, they came up to an inlet which presented them with 2 choices. They could either walk around it and add untold miles to their trek, or they could swim across it. Now, today, Australia has a well-known reputation for the massive crocodiles that inhabit only their northern region. This was not always so familiar to the outside world, and it wasn't known to either Hans or Klausman. The 2 men then stripped down and entered the water, carrying their clothes over their heads as they waded across the inlet. Suddenly, one of them spotted a dark, scaly figure coming right for them. Both men immediately dropped their clothing and began swimming as hard as they could in a desperate attempt to save their lives. Thankfully, the crocodile wasn't interested in putting up too much of a chase, and it allowed them to make an escape. Reaching safety on the other side of the inlet was about their only stroke of luck since having set the plane down, but the decision to cross the water instead of walking around it came at a great price. They were now stranded and lost in searing heat without clothing and their boots. Worse yet, among the items they dropped in their panic over the crocodile were their pistols. This felt like a major turning point for Hans. As long as they had their firearms, they always had a chance to find and secure food for themselves. Without them, the 2 knew next to nothing about how to capture game in the Australian bush. So, naked and barefoot, the 2 men had to admit defeat. They would end up deciding that their best course of action was to head back to the plane, meaning their swim across the inlet and the loss of all their supplies was completely pointless. They did, however, learn from this and decide to walk inland instead of getting back into the water. It would also end up taking the better part of the next 7 days to get back to the plane. During that time, the sun beat down on them and the mosquitoes picked at their skin, and when they checked out the area around the plane, they were both disheartened to find it exactly as they left it. For the last leg of the trek, they held on to hope that someone had come across the plane and was there waiting for them, but that was unfortunately not the case. By then, they had been stranded on the Kimberley coast for 13 days with very little food, and now back at the plane, the area was completely devoid of fresh water. Hans was the kind of guy who always seemed to have an endless supply of energy, and this trait served him well during their ordeal to that point, but he was starting to feel weaker and more exhausted as each day passed. He knew that it was only going to get worse if they didn't find a better situation fast, so he started thinking of a way to get them practically anywhere else. This caused him to take a closer look at the Atlantis. Their Junkers W-33 seaplane had the ability to touch down on land and in water thanks to two large pontoons called floats that are fixed underneath the plane. Each of the floats had 4 airtight compartments that kept the plane buoyant, and if they could hold the forces of water landings, Hans wondered if they could hold up against the open ocean too. He then presented this idea to Klausman, and the pair got to work removing one of the floats. Using scrap wood and whatever else he could find, Hans fitted the makeshift boat with a crude sail and rudder, and with a piece of aluminum he made paddles. As they were wrapping up their construction, a rain shower came through, which gave Hans another idea. He opened another one of the watertight compartments and allowed it to fill with some rainwater. Neither of them knew how long they'd be on the ocean, but if they somehow got stuck out there for any length of time, having some fresh water would be crucial to their survival. Before they set off, Hans also drained whatever water remained from the plane's radiator. Finally and carefully, the men carried the float-turned kayak to the water and hopped into their designated compartments. They then pushed off, but within moments, the rudder was ripped off by the waves and the sail proved completely worthless. By the time they figured out that they were aimless and directionless, the plane float had gotten into the current and was being pulled out to sea. The only way the exhausted men could navigate the float was with their paddles, which were only marginally helpful. Several days would end up passing with the float stuck about 12 miles off the Kimberley coast when one of them saw a large black speck on the horizon. Over the course of minutes, it got bigger and bigger until they realized it was a ship. They weren't able to stand up in the float compartments, but they did everything they could to draw attention to themselves. The two stood there and shouted and screamed, and in their minds it was all but certain they would be saved. But then at a distance of about 1,600 feet, the ship passed by them without hesitation. When it was clear the ship was gone and began to disappear into the distance, they slumped back into their compartments. The disappointment was beyond description, and when Hans looked at Klausman, he immediately knew that something was off about him. It was like something had changed, like Klausman had broken on the inside. After a while, they continued paddling, and Hans had to do much of the work since Klausman was becoming despondent. Even still, for 4 nights and the better part of 5 days afterward, they paddled before miraculously reaching land northwest of Cape Bernier. Back on solid ground, they rested briefly before Hans had them back on their feet. Still certain they were on Melville Island, Hans felt like they might be able to find civilization if they just walked inland. So for a week, they traveled across some of the world's most deadly terrain without a stitch of clothing on their bodies or anything on their feet. Soon enough, Hans finally came to the realization that they couldn't be where he thought they were. The distances just didn't make sense. If they were where he thought they were, they should have seen some semblance of civilization. So, once again, the best thing to do in his mind was to backtrack their way to the coast and find the plane float. After another week of walking, the two men located the plane float and made another disheartening discovery. The float had somehow gotten damaged in their absence. Hans thought there was a chance it could still keep them above water if he cut off the affected compartment, so he grabbed a pair of tin snips and was careful not to puncture the neighboring compartment. They managed to carry the float back to the water and hop into it, but they quickly found out that it was no longer even minimally seaworthy. When they got back on shore, they located a rock ledge overhang at Cape Bernier to shelter under, and both men collapsed. Almost 4 days after contact with the Atlantis had stopped back in May, the German consul raised the alarm with the Western Australian government and requested that a search effort be organized to find the two men. Mail planes became search planes, and all the ships sailing along the Australian coast were notified to keep an eye out for a plane or castaways. Additionally, Aboriginal tribes were recruited to assist in finding the men, as no group was more intimately familiar with the land than the country's indigenous people. And incredibly, while searching on foot, one group located a cigarette case with the initials HB on it and a handkerchief in the sand. These items were then handed off to be taken to search officials. On June 15th, more than 1 month after it disappeared, a search plane located the Atlantis about 99 miles or 160 kilometers from the town of Wyndham in Western Australia. Unfortunately, there was no sign of the two missing aviators, but searchers felt like they were now hot on their trail. At the same time the search was ratcheting up, the will to live had faded from Hans and Klausman. They had sort of come to accept their fate, which they believed was to wait inside a Cape Bernier cave for death to find them. But while lying around close to lifeless on the morning of June 22nd, an Aboriginal man, not the same one they encountered earlier, noticed the two men just inside the mouth of the cave and went to investigate. When he reached them, the man was confident that this was who he and many others had been searching for. Hans opened his eyes and squinted upwards as he felt someone watching him. When his vision cleared, he could barely believe what he was witnessing. And unlike the Aboriginal men Hans and Klausman encountered on their first night, they were able to establish communication. The Aboriginal man had a fish that he eagerly handed over, but both men were so weak and dehydrated that they couldn't even chew their own food. The man then helped them by literally chewing up pieces of fish, spitting them out, and then hand-feeding them. After some time, and with some of their strength returning, the man led them to a well-protected bay where they made camp. Once they got there, he handed Hans 2 tins full of preserved meat and 5 pounds of flour. That evening, he also speared a kangaroo to the amazement of the men before cooking it and feeding them once again. The next morning, 2 more Aboriginal men showed up. The food the night before had done wonders for Hans and Klausman, but they were still weakened from their ordeal. And although each of them was demonstrating different symptoms of mental instability, Hans was loose enough to write out a quick note and hand it to one of the men. The night before, the Aboriginal man that fed them told them about a priest nearby, so Hans instructed one of them to get the message to him. On the note were a few details about their ordeal and information about where they were located. Then, finally, on July 6, all that the 2 men had endured would come to a conclusion. That morning, more Aboriginal people arrived at the Cape Rainier camp with supplies sent by the priest, and not long after, the rest of the search party arrived. Just like he had with the man who found them in the cave, Hans excitedly greeted the new arrivals and shook each of their hands. In turn, they gave him oranges, bread and butter, and cigarettes, which Hans and Klausman immediately began smoking. Both of them were eventually taken to Wyndham, and once they arrived, Klausman was in such bad shape that he had to be carried ashore. In addition to severe dehydration and malnutrition, he was still suffering mentally from when he reached his breaking point on the ocean. Hans then instructed rescuers to get Klausman to the hospital, but despite Hans insisting that he was also fine, he was made to go along too. At the hospital, they were treated to a large breakfast, and Klausman was put into a bed to rest and recover. Hans was certainly better off than his companion, and while he had lost a lot of weight and suffered from dehydration, his condition didn't require him to be hospitalized. From the moment they landed in Cape St. Lambert until they reached the safety of the hospital, more than 50 days had passed. In the aftermath of the ordeal, Hans returned to the site of the Atlantis with another mechanic, and they were able to get the plane in working order. They then flew it to Perth, Australia. Klausman, however, was in such bad condition both physically and mentally, he was put aboard a steamship bound for Germany. The newspapers that reported on the incident noted that Klausman was expected to make a full recovery, but he never did. He remained in a broken mental state for the rest of his life. Hans, meanwhile, was also mentally traumatized by his experience, but he stayed behind in Australia for a few months and essentially went on a speaking tour to tell his harrowing survival story. He then went from town to town, giving talks to crowds that were eager to hear about what happened directly from one of the men who experienced it. And this ambition almost cost him his life yet again when he crashed the plane at an airport on landing. The Atlantis suffered extensive damage, but Hans managed to escape without any serious injury. In the aftermath as well, and during interviews with the reporters serving a very interested public, Hans would go out of his way to heap praise on the Aboriginal man who found them at Cape Rainier and those who arrived the next day. Along with helping to feed them, ensuring they were replenished with as much water as they could, the Aboriginal men built what's called a bush humpy, which is a small hut constructed with available materials. This was in order to keep Klausman protected from the elements in his poor state of health. In addition, in fact, from the moment they encountered the indigenous men, Hans said he finally felt like someone was on their side, which boosted their morale and restored their hopes of leaving the Australian bush alive. Hans also gave full credit to the men for saving their lives, as it's almost certain that both of them would have been dead long before the European search party located them. And until his death in 1993 at the age of 86, Hans would always refer to his Aboriginal saviors as his best friends. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.